Thanks for coming to this event, Radical Interpretations of the Present Crisis. This panel has been brought together by the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm Lucy Parker, I'm a member of London Platypus, and I'll be moderating the panel. Platypus aims to bring individuals and organisations into discussion with each other around a particular issue, to ask what it means to be on the left today. Panelists may not, in fact hopefully will not, agree with each other on this question. Through doing so, we aim to open up new conversation, clarify ideas through disagreements, and uncover unexpected points of agreement as well. Platypus started as a reading group in 2006 in Chicago with students from the School of the Art Institute Chicago and the University of Chicago. We became an organisation when we decided we wanted to put together public forums such as these, and a monthly newspaper, the Platypus Review. The Platypus Review remains an open submission publication, our forum in print. I want to invite any of you today who may be interested to write for the Platypus Review to talk to me or to Laurie afterwards. Copies are available to take, they're free, and you'll find our email on our handout. This event, as with other Platypus events, has been conceived of taking place in different cities. It took place in New York on the 14th of November with Lauren Goldner, Paul Matic, David Harvey, and Andrew Kleiman, and will shortly be taking place in Chicago too. Recordings of all events will be available on our media website, media.platypus1917.org. Today's panel may have a very different character to that of New York, so I would encourage you to check out the ones online too. Due to our time constraints, we're giving our four speakers 12 minutes for introductory remarks, responding to questions that we've circulated to them in the programme. These questions are meant to be a guide, as it will probably be hard to address them in the time sufficiently. But they can be returned to you during Q&A. After presentations, I'll ask for a round of 2 to 3 minute responses from the panelists on each other's presentations, followed by opening up to Q&A. So without further ado, I'll just introduce our panel. Firstly, we have Hillel Tichten, Professor Emeritus of Marxist Studies at the University of Glasgow, and editor and founder of Critique, Journal of Socialist Theory, which will be 40 years old in 2013. He is author of Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, Essays on the Political Economy of the Disintegrating System, and Politics of Race, Discrimination in South Africa. His articles are also regularly published in the Weekly Worker. We then have Saul Newman, a reader in political theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. His books include Unstable Universalities, Post-Structuralism and Radical Politics, Power and Politics in Post-Structuralist Thought, New Theories of Political, From Bakunin to Lacan, Anti-Authoritarianism and the Dislocation of Power. His most recent book is The Politics of Post-Anarchism, published in 2011. We then have David Graeber, a reader in social anthropology from Goldsmiths, University of London as well. He has been involved in much social and political activism from protests at the World Economic Forum in New York City in 2002, all the way through to Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and 10. Among many books, he published The First 5,000 Years in 2011. His forthcoming book, The Democracy Project, A History, a Crisis, a Movement, is due for publication in 2013. And finally, we have James Woodhuysen, Professor of Forecasting and Innovation at De Montfort University. He was battened charged by police outside Pentonville Jail in July 1972 as part of the efforts to free 5 imprisoned dock workers, expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party for dissent in 1973, and expelled from France for bringing in by car literature opposing British imperialism in Ireland. He is co-author of Why is Construction So Backward? And Energize, A Future for Innovation, and he is editor of Big Potatoes, The London Manifesto for Innovation, published in 2012. He is also a contributor for Spiked Online. Okay, so without further ado, I'll invite our first speaker, Hillel Tichten, to speak.
Thank you. Thanks. First, I'd like to thank the organisers, Platypus and Lucy, for organising the conference. I think it's a very good idea to have a lot more debates of this kind. in order to bring the left together. Now, the topic in effect is crisis. And I define a crisis, or follow Marx in defining a crisis, as a situation within capitalism where all the contradictions come together. That's roughly the way he defines it. That seems to me to make sense. From that point of view, this really is the first crisis since 1945. The various downturns are downturns. They are minor downturns which effectively the state arranged in order to keep inflation down. More or less, not wholly so, but more or less. Today is very, very different. It's hard to say anything else. But if you consider it in terms of the usual statistics used in the newspapers, the GDP growth, or for that matter, even in terms of standard of living, in Britain it's worse than the Great Depression. The logical conclusion is one would have to call it a depression, and we note, of course, people no doubt have seen the number of Keynesian economists are in fact calling it a depression. That's the correct term. It is a depression. It was asked to discuss crisis and compare it with previous crises, and the obvious comparison is the Great Depression. Yes, it's like the Great Depression. In fact, in Britain, it's even worse in crucial. Not in every respect, but in crucial areas it clearly is worse. It's not worse in the United States, but it's pretty bad and could get worse. So I don't think there's any question of where we are. We are in a depression. We are in a crisis in the sense that the system itself is in a situation where it doesn't know where to go. To put it another way, there are three ways in which it could actually go. The crises, of course, or the different aspects of the crisis, could in principle be resolved and we'll be back to where we were. I think that's extremely unlikely. There's no indication that it can go that way. The second way it could go is it could go on the way it is now. That's to say, one problem after another, one attempt at dealing with the poles of the contradictions and failing to do so. It is not a coincidence that we have a government which is so weak in this country, or for that matter in the United States or in France or in Germany. It's not a coincidence. It's because they cannot deal with the real social tensions which now exist throughout the world and which are clearly getting worse from their point of view and from our point of view. That is a deeper reflection of something else itself. The third way it can go is simply that the polarities in the contradiction are unable to come together. They conflict, continue to conflict, and we begin to get a disintegration of the system itself, or society. Now, this is not the same thing, but in the Soviet Union, when it came to an end, that's exactly what did happen from 1992 onwards. If you remember, many people in the population were forced to go outside the towns and grow their own food. The society actually did begin to disintegrate. The society disintegrated, or began to do so. What happened there is another question. But that is one possible way in which it can go, increasing chaos, in other words. It's very easy to see the way it can go that way, increasing chaos, increasing disintegration. And of course, finally, it could also go in the most optimistic scene. We would see that the society moved over to the new society, socialism. Those are the possibilities, effectively, and I just stated them abstractly, but just stating them indicates where we are today. It is as barefaced as that. To understand that, we have to go back to understanding the background and the historical background, in fact, of capitalism in the last 150 years, in fact. Capitalism itself is not inherently stable. As we all know, that's why we are here, effectively. The working class, in principle, as capitalism does develop, becomes increasingly powerful. If not in theoretical and ideological terms in its actual positions within the actual society. And I think we have to look to the period after the war in which the mechanisms of capitalism were somewhat contained, were deliberately contained, that's to say commodity fetishism and secondly the reserve army of labour, which ultimately meant they could not control the working class, which did lead to the 60s and 70s and their pulling the rug. In other words, one can't look at this crisis simply as a technical crisis of banks. And I'll go back to what I just said, but as an intermission, I think I have to go and deal with the popular illusion that the issue is one of banks. It's not. If you look at every single crisis, if you can call them crises, every single one of them, and you certainly see it in reading Marx, in volume 3 of Marx, where he discusses banks, banking, and crisis of banks, and so forth. There has been a monetary problem, crisis, or banking crisis in every instance. If we look, even in the past 50, 60 years, the downturns always ended in that form. There's no time to discuss the mechanism for it, but it's a necessary result of any crisis that you'll get an extension of credit, and the credit in the end will break. So one has to look not at the banks or credit or whatever, one has to look at the underlying aspect of it. The only aspect in which one has to discuss the banking crisis is that what it did is extend the period of time before the crisis actually hit. And since people involved in finance wanted to enrich themselves, they did so. That's the main aspect of it, that it became almost a criminal enterprise in itself. But it did so precisely because there was a pile-up of money, which brings me back to the point. There was a pile-up of money once they deliberately decided, the ruling class deliberately decided, that they would not go for growth, they would cut growth, they would raise the number of people unemployed, try to reintroduce the reserve army of labour. So we have to look at it in terms of the class struggle itself and not just the form. We have to look at both the form and of course the class struggle. But what I'm now doing is trying to bring together the aspect of form and the aspect of class struggle. And what I'm saying here is that it became necessary for the capitalist class effectively to pull the plug, end the Bretton Woods settlement, which is the Keynesian settlement, and try and get back to the 19th century. That's basically what they were trying to do under Thatcher, but they didn't go the whole way. They are now trying to go the whole way, taking the opportunity. The essential basis, therefore, of the crisis lies ultimately, even if what appears to be abstracted, it lies in the class struggle. So, what one had was a pile-up of money which could not be invested. Now, in every depression that's been the case. That was true of the Great Depression too. That is why there was this tremendous discussion around money, the question of confidence, which today if you ask bankers or anybody in the economy what's the problem, they say confidence. Now, the fact that they say confidence immediately alerts you to the fact there must be something wrong with the word confidence. Well, of course there is. What they mean by confidence is something else. But interestingly, in the third volume of Capital, I happened to be reading Marx and Crisis, and he refers to confidence also. So it's not a concept invented for the present time, though you might well have thought so, the way they give confidence as the entire reason for the downturn. The capitalist class is not confident, so it will not invest, so we have a pile-up of money. And the statistic I usually give, and I've always given the last year or so, is the amount, the pile-up of money you've got in one bank, Bank New York Mellon, where the last time I looked, they had $27 trillion. Just sitting there, not invested. In fact, they're charging people money for putting the money in the bank in the first place. So you would have thought, given the needs of the world population, they might have dreamed up a few ideas of investing somewhere, like trying to save the planet. But they're not interested, they've got no confidence. So they don't invest. Of course, what they mean is that if they invest, they will not get a sufficient return, or they might even lose their money completely, which is perfectly possible, of course. So they will not invest, and so we're stuck. Now you then have to ask, well, what do you do at that point? How do you change it? Well, the only way they will invest is if they guarantee over the last 20 to 50, next 20 to 50 years that the investments will be returned with sufficient profit. The only way they can do that is what the right wing are demanding all the time, which, as in the case of the Republican Party, as in the case of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, and with our government, they're all demanding effectively abolition of welfare benefits, taking us back to the 19th century. But 19th century capitalism is impossible. You can't do it. We can't have people in workhouses, which is what it boils down to. It's absurd. The whole project they're putting forward is absurd. It's crazy. Now, I'm not the only person to say it's crazy, although I've been saying it for years. Many people now say, well, the whole project is crazy. It's impossible. It is impossible, but they have no other way out. So they're going on with it. That is where we are. Thank you.
Okay, I might just sit down, that's right. I've just prepared a couple of answers. I haven't answered all the questions actually, just because it would have been impossible within 12 minutes. So I've answered the questions that I thought were more interesting to me, which I had a greater capacity to speak on. I suppose my approach is somewhat more different from Hillel's. It's more theoretical, a bit more philosophical, and less economic perhaps. So I was asked to, of course, comment on whether or not this is a kind of a crisis. I would say the following: while capitalism has always been crisis-ridden, and indeed we can even say that crisis is the very motor of capitalism, the limit that allows it to reinvent itself. But what's different now, I think, is that this moment of crisis has become our permanent horizon. Crisis, and indeed even catastrophe, has become part of the symbolic order of capitalism, and we do live without a foreseeable future. We can no longer plausibly look forward to the restabilization of capitalism or the return of life as normal. Rather, I think there's a sort of an abyss or an emptiness confronting us, as if it's now impossible to think in the long term, to make forecasts and predictions and so on. So in this sense, the crisis is more than an economic one. It's political, because the failure and nihilism of our political institutions is visible for all to see. And it's also social, because we're confronted with the limits and the impossibility of a certain way of life, a certain form of identity which we become familiar with, a certain place within, a certain stable place within capitalist social relations, a very way of seeing ourselves as one who consumes, who invests, who plans for retirement, is now completely thrown into chaos, actually. We simply can't see ourselves in the same way. So the real crisis, from the point of view of capitalism at least, is that people have stopped believing in it. They've stopped having faith in it. People no longer believe the system will resurrect itself. They're no longer prepared to bank on a brighter future. And we can see this quite, we talked about confidence a moment ago, we can see this quite clearly in falling levels of consumer spending, which leads to a crisis of investor confidence. Now, governments and financial systems want things to simply go back to normal. They want to perpetuate our continual enslavement to the financial system through debt and through consumer spending, in the hope that it will sort of kickstart the economy again. But this is simply not working. So I think this is a crisis of desire. And this is why it's much more serious and probably terminal than all the crises and crashes which have occurred before. And this crisis obviously can't be analysed separately from the looming environmental catastrophe, a dwindling, barren world quickly turning into a wasteland by a rapacious capitalism. So any attempts to re-stimulate the economy will eventually run up against the limit of an exhausted material base. Yet in the face of all this, I feel strangely calm and even welcome the coming storm. The origins of the word crisis in Greek mean a situation that's reached a decisive turning point. Medically, it refers to the moment when a disease has reached a turning point that will lead either to the rehabilitation or the death of the patient. We come to see that there is no rehabilitation, no life, no future in the continuation of capitalism, which may itself already be dead and only kept alive through artificial means. What capitalism cannot survive is a crisis of desire. In other words, the possibility of a different form of subjectivity emerging whose libidinal drives are no longer directed towards work and consumption for their satisfaction. For us, for humanity itself, recovery does not mean the recovery of capitalism, but rather the recovery of life and autonomous organisation beyond capitalism. In other words, the recovery of the future. What will take its place? Who can say? This is a time for invention, experimentation, and new forms of autonomous self-organisation, modes of exchange, and new ways of being together. We can no longer look to the state for salvation. The state is nothing but a broken husk, an empty shell. The crisis will mean that we will have to develop new networks of mutual assistance and cooperation. It's time to stop lamenting the crisis. It's time to stop being angry with the government. They're just irrelevant puppets of the system. It's time, I would say, to start preparing for the future. No doubt there have been I was asked to comment on structural changes since Marx's time. Obviously, there's been lots of structural changes since that time, the shift to post-industrial capitalism in the West, the fragmentation and displacement of class identities, the emphasis on consumption rather than production. The collapse of the socialist workers' movement does not make the overcoming of capitalism impossible. On the contrary, it may well be the condition for it. The fact that there is no privileged revolutionary agent, which is always an illusory promise in any case, means that we need to reconsider the whole project of revolution and to think instead in terms of insurrections. I was also asked to comment on whether a certain kind of analysis of the world as it is will be able to bring about any change. All the sophisticated leftist analyses of the world have been unable to bring about any change because they were not able to account for the libidinal economy of capitalism, the way it organises, intensifies and constructs desire and enjoyment, or what we might call jouissance in psychoanalytic terms. And this is why the Marxist analysis of ideology in terms of truth distortion and false consciousness never worked. Our perpetuation of the capitalist system was not because we cannot see things the way we were, but rather because our desire and our whole subjectivity was implicated in it. Because at some level, perhaps even in a masochistic sense, we enjoyed it. What will finally enable us to see beyond capitalism is not when we finally see it for what it is, but when we no longer enjoy it. When, in other words, there is a modification in our libidinal economy, in our whole subjectivity, in such a way that we become invested in something else. We become invested in ourselves, perhaps for the first time, beyond the miserable category of the liberal individual or homo economicus. And this means that the means by which we might transcend capitalism does not lie in developing a more scientific analysis. Marxism, of course, always had the aspiration of being a science. But in the invention, I would say, of new modes of subjectivity, new ways of life that are no longer channeled by and conformed to an economic rationality. I'm just going to comment very briefly on Occupy, actually, which was one of the other questions that I was asked to respond to. I do not see Occupy as a class-based movement. It was certainly nothing like the socialist labour movement in the classical sense, and the Marxist and socialist left has no right to claim an exclusive hegemony over it. Indeed, what was surprising and genuinely innovative about this movement was a radical break from the politics and identities of the past. Rather than being constituted by class identities, it was what I would call politics of post-identity, the politics of heterogeneous singularities who were not defined by a class background or by a kind of work, but who gathered together spontaneously, rhizomatically around a common desire to create something different, to create an autonomous space in which new relations between people could emerge that were no longer based around fixed identities. Anonymity and singularity, not class identity, are the conditions for the insurrection today. And what was striking was the absence of the usual modes of communication and representation. There were no demands, no programs, no revolutionary blueprints. Just a coming together of singularities without anything in common, apart from a desire to create new relations and subjectivities. The mode of communication, on the contrary, was completely innovative, decentralized and gestural. Lastly, there was no party, no centralized leadership, no formal representatives, no Lenin waiting in the wings to take over state power. Those times are over. The vanguardist form of revolutionary politics is completely defunct. This is the time not of revolution but of insurrection, of the creation of autonomous spaces and relations and new collective intensities. And Occupy gave us a glimpse of the possibilities of the insurrection today. I think I'll leave it there, actually. Okay. Thank you.
I too am somewhat and overwhelmed by the range of things that we're going to cover, so I will be selective. Well, first of all, I just have to say this. This is disturbing. This is the second time I've been in this room in a month or so. And like the first time I made this comment, well, isn't it strange that we have a panel on economics and it's all white guys over 40, you know. Here I am again. Oh, okay, well, there you go. Actually, the first time I said middle-aged, Michael Albert said, no, I'm old. And the next one's going to be the same. Yeah, okay, I just have to say that. All right. The last panel I saw here ended with a comment that we have to create a situation where the ruling class is actually afraid of us. And I think one of the paradoxes of the situation we're in now is that, in fact, the ruling class is terrified of us, and we are the ones who don't actually perceive that. I think almost everything we see around us, politically and economically, has emerged from that fear. We live in a situation where the people running the system are actually obsessed with the fact that no one can imagine an alternative, because they realize that nobody actually believes in the viability of the system either anymore. So we're their greatest threat, because the moment there's something that seems like a viable alternative, no one will have any reason to keep reproducing a system that, like, increasingly nobody except a very small percentage of the population particularly likes. I actually like I'm sort of fond of the Midnight Notes analysis of the two cycles of post-war capitalism. To describe what sort of crisis we're in now is that 2008 came from a crisis of inclusion. They make the argument that in the immediate wake of World War II, there was a kind of a deal, a famous Keynesian deal that was struck. Wages were tied to productivity, welfare states were created. There was a basic deal that, you guys don't become communists, at least the sort of white working class of North Atlantic countries. We will cut you in to a certain degree on the deal. And you could see all political struggles through the 70s of more and more people saying, well, what about us? And sort of wanting in on the same deal. Whether it's excluded minorities like the civil rights movement in America, whether it's similar classes of people, ordinative or working class elites in the global South, so forth and so on, up to including feminism. And at a certain point it breaks, because capitalism can't work by offering a reasonable deal to the majority of the working class. Once it gets to a point where they can't resist demand, a certain level of demand, then the whole thing falls apart, and they have to start over again. So the next deal, which kind of takes form in the 70s, is okay, everybody can have political rights, because political rights will have no economic guarantees at all attached to them, but everybody gets credit. Which largely the Keynesian deal is broken, productivity continues to go up, wages stagnate or go down. But there's this huge extension of credit on all levels, from mortgages to 401ks in America, to the extension of microcredit as the way of solving all problems in the global South. Obviously, that's not viable, and again, you have this crisis of inclusion that starts happening, kind of comes to the peak of 2008. Not insignificantly around subprime mortgages, which are people who have ever given mortgages to at all in the past, and obvious scam mortgages. The system falls apart, and they seem to be still paddling around trying to figure out what the new dispensation is going to be, which is a sign of prolonged crisis. So in fact, that crisis isn't really over. I was talking to someone at the Federal Reserve the other day, or junior person at the Federal Reserve. Yeah, if they're talking to me at all, these guys have big trouble, right? And he said, well, in 2 or 3 years, there's going to be another 2008, it'll be much worse, unless we do massive mortgage cancellation. We can't get through politically. So these guys are, those small percentage, I'd say about 10% of the ruling class, that actually care about the long-term viability of the system, because mostly they taught themselves to look about a 2 or 3 year horizon. Those who actually take a longer-term perspective, they're scared shitless. They don't know what to do. They're looking at anything. So how did this come about? Well, I really think that the what's actually going on in this sort of last post-70s phase is the almost obsessive prioritizing of the political over the economic. I mean, I think that's what neoliberalism really means. I actually figured this out. I sort of had this breakthrough when I went to an IMF protest in 2002, and it was after 9/11. We were all like, we did it basically just to keep our own spirits up. We knew we were going to shut down the meetings, but when we showed up there, there were like 300 anarchists and like 5,000 police everywhere with like all sorts of SWAT teams and heavy equipment. But we just felt utterly overwhelmed and demoralized and depressed and went home. And then I talked to someone actually at the meetings, and they said everyone who actually went to the meetings came home utterly demoralized and depressed too, because essentially the cops shut down the meeting. There's so many levels of security, so much was shut down that they couldn't even really meet. Most of them didn't even show up. They just teleconference. They were all completely demoralized. And I realized that it's more important to the police that 300 anarchists go home feeling like shit than that the IMF meetings actually happen. Like, what does that tell you about how important they think we are? And you realize, you can look at almost everything they do in this sort of preemptive mode. Even the war in Iraq, they lost the war in Iraq. Why did they lose it? Because they were so obsessed with like getting over the Vietnam syndrome, as I called it, like making a war that was entirely could not be resisted at home, that there was no effective anti-war movement. They calculated, well, we have to make sure there's very few American casualties. In order to ensure that, they had to create rules of engagement, which like killed endless women and children in Iraq, thus alienating people so much that they lost the war, right? But they don't care, because again, it was more important that the anti-war movement doesn't get off the ground than that they win the war. And I think that's a metaphor for what's going on economically as well. Almost all of the sort of economic moves which we identified with neoliberal capitalism, creation of precarious labor, for example, it doesn't create more efficient labor. I mean, at all, I don't think. I think that it's incredibly effective at depoliticizing labor. On a million different levels. Even the mortgage crisis and debt, I mean, to some degree, Alan Greenspan actually admitted this at one point, one of the major aims was to break the labor movement, because if you have a mortgage and you're in debt, you can't really strike. So it's actually been one of the mechanisms bringing wages down. So they put all their cards on the political side. In the meantime, the weight of all this, all of these mechanisms to make people, to destroy alternative sources of vision, half of the educational system, the same thing, it's political, right? They completely discredited themselves, the system collapses, so what do? They say, well, where might another idea come from? It's like, take that out immediately and submit it to neoliberal logic. So by emphasizing the political, they put us in a paradoxical situation where the system is crumbling all around us. It doesn't even claim to be able to actually do the things it used to, technological advance, lift all boats, so forth and so on. They're not even saying it does that. They're just saying no other system is possible. We have the situation where the system is visibly crumbling, and the one victory they've achieved is this war on the imagination where nobody can imagine anything else. So it seems to me, in this sense, there's enormous areas for hope. All we really have to do, and this is one reason why the Occupy movement took the strategy that it did, coming out of it was a crest of a wave that was sweeping the world, starting in the Middle East, of course. Is simply, creating a camp was a way of saying, shoving in their face the idea that other values and other ways of existing are possible. I mean, really, if you do it on a sufficient scale, that's all you have to do at this point, because the system is almost entirely delegitimated itself, and which also explains their extraordinarily militaristic kind of reaction to the mere existence of a bunch of people sitting around in a park. So I'll throw that out for now, and we can take more details up in question.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I'd like to thank Platypus, who brought the weather with them. It's sunny out there. It's also cool.
James, could you use the mic?
Do you insist?
Well, only
Is anybody?
People need to hear it at home because it's being streamed. So I don't hear you through the microphone.
Well, anyway, and it's nice to see people reading the FT on the left. That's nice. And I disagree with most of what's been said today, but I think the atmosphere of judgmental tolerance is the right one. So I want to say thanks for that. Just to answer the question, the left's not very good at answering the question. We've had some attempts, which is good news. Do we live in a crisis of capitalism, political, economic, or social? Well, it's most strikingly a political crisis because the capitalist class has no forward vision, no plan for growth, and not even a plan for raping the planet, as some of our ecological friends seem to think. It's most differently economic. I think that it's all very well for Hillel to talk about the Depression or the 19th century, but neither of those periods really saw what's happening in Asia today. And Asia has been completely absent from the discussion so far. And I think that also means that it's a crisis of innovation in the West. There is some crisis of innovation in the East, but not as great. And that's very new. It's quite different, really, from what happened in the 30s or the 19th century. And finally, is it social? I think the unprecedented social fact of our times is the aversion to risk. I heard also from our postmodernist friend Federico that ideas were risky. That was fun to hear. I thought we were here for ideas, but never mind. Are the laws of motion the same? They're the same-ish, but I think the accumulation of the three things I've talked about, political stasis, innovation slowdown, and state-regulated risk aversion, have turned quantity into quality a bit. So the laws of motion are probably similar, but we've got new stuff on top that really needs to be addressed. And I partly like Hillel's remarks about the banks not being responsible for the crisis, but I'm sure Hillel will go further in looking at the cash hoards of IT companies, energy companies, and pharmaceutical companies. That's how not different really, they are from the banks. They are lowering their R&D, which in the case of energy is extremely weak, while the Asians are increasing it, and they are increasing their cash hoards. Mainstream companies are quite similar to the banks in all of this regard. And that does speak of an unwillingness to invest in the future. It does speak of a subjective crisis of risk aversion as well. I think that is very new, and characteristically it's not addressed by the left. So when we come to question 2, why are sophisticated leftist understandings of the world seemingly unable to assist, blah, blah. Well, I question the word sophisticated. I'm delighted to hear the old canard from Saul here, who I would have thought knew better, that Marxism is partly about false consciousness. I urge you, go to Marxist.org, I think it is. They got the complete works of Marx and Lenin, Trotsky. I don't think you'll ever see the phrase by Marx. Correct me if I'm wrong on this.
Phrase, but
well.
We'll talk about this later.
We're going to do
So, but I think also, the doctrine that Saul also puts forward, that our resources are exhausted. I don't know whether you read the papers, Saul, but the peak oil theory has had to disappear in the past few years because so much oil is being discovered. No water is leaving the planet. No sunshine has been, even in England, has been caught lowering. So we've got an enormous amount of energy which innovation could do a lot for. So I don't see a resource crisis, and I think that it shows what we really need to do, among other things, is address consumer issues, not in such as energy, not in an anti-consumerist way. I was delighted to hear our media friend in the first session saying, let's hear it for fridges. Hooray for the fridge. I think that's terrific. We need to be able to take up issues like that because they are part of not false consciousness but popular consciousness. The left is characteristically, as on Asia, as on innovation, generally not prepared to take up consumer issues except to concede to green and liberal sentiment on this question. So let me just say that the world is more intelligible than it was before. I think, with the new tools we've got, such as the internet, that makes it difficult but not impossible. It was always difficult. The world is not completely different from the past, but it is very different. And the crisis of risk aversion that I've referred to, and the fact that parenting is regarded as risky, leadership is regarded as toxic, Disease is something that happens in computer viruses. Obesity is catching. We all need to nudge our way with the state out of obesity and these things. I think that does show that capitalism is very different from the crisis of the past. I think Platypus is right to say that Occupy movement is an end of old social movements and not a revitalization of it. I go further, in fact, I would say that Occupy brings to a close the Galbraithian era, the era of Democratic Party dissent, begun by Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, by all kinds of Democratic dissenters, Marcuse. You can look at Jane Jacobs, The Life and Death of American Cities. You can look at Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. The period from 57 to 63, which is also that of Vance Packard believing that advertising was a big problem, and also that waste and packaging and exhaustion of the Earth's resources was a big problem. I think Occupy is the final culmination of that bourgeois tradition of dissent. The early dissenters were much more eloquent than Occupy will ever be. That's why I can't bother to introduce any demands, something that Saul applauds, but I put down for the lack of any ideas. The Occupy agenda, insofar as it has ideas, is all about greed. And for me, that shows its commonalities with Obama and the Cameron people and all of that. Money is the root of all evil, or love of money is the root of all evil, was an insight from the Bible. So I thank Occupy for repeating it so late on in life. And I think when the question 3 says, is it different from is today's crisis different from the crisis of Fordism beginning in the late 1960s and crystallizing with the oil crisis in 73? Fordism, like Stuart Hall, is a concept pioneered by the Euro-communist wing, the Marxism Today wing, of the Communist Party of Great Britain in the 80s. So I'm a bit sad that Platypus seem to be endorsing it there, but I put it down to a typographical error. And I think, the view that we really had an oil crisis in the early 70s, rather than the beginnings of the innovation slowdown that I've talked about, also means that our sophisticated left wing is not so sophisticated. How long will it last, the crisis? The duration is up to us. And one of the main errors that's being made here today is to believe, does the present crisis at least signal an end to neoliberalism? Apart from Asia, there's one thing that hasn't been mentioned today, just a small thing, maybe you noticed it, the Leveson inquiry. I believe I'm the first to mention it in this room. No credit is due to me, and no credit is due to Seamus Milne of The Guardian and Anna Minton, also of The Guardian, for failing to show up here today. But that only underlines for me the point that liberalism, not neoliberalism, is the main problem that we face today. And the liberal desire to regulate the press is something that should entertain us much more than Cameron's reputed neoliberal tendencies, or his desire to send us all back to the 30s or to the 19th century. Just to conclude, how are we doing? All right. There's no such thing as economics in Marxism. There's a critique of political economy. So that's in partly in relation to question 5. I think there are some interesting questions. They're very good questions from Platypus, apart from the Fordist businesses. You say, how do you avoid the danger of your theory from simply confirming your politics? I think that is a problem, and I think I'm always surprised how events do vindicate my theories, but also things seem to be much worse than my theories have ever surmised. So I think we're in the era of predictable surprises, and if anything, the accent is on the surprise rather than the predictable. Right? I like to think I don't know how bad things are going to get, and then capitalism always surprises me, and I think that can be a useful point of view. Just to end. Is the era of US hegemony at an end? Well, this is why the discussion on Asia is rather important, ladies and gentlemen, because if you're not following the Senkaku dispute between Japan and China and America's role in all of that, one can't give a proper answer to that. So I would hope, along with Levison, that we can have a bit of a discussion now about Asia in this atmosphere of judgmental tolerance that I've commended to you. I think the most striking thing about the Senkaku disputes and the exercise of US power now is that it's not a war for resources any more than the Iraq war was a war for oil. Resources play a role, but they're not the main event. I think what's striking about events in the East China Sea and the South China Sea is the arbitrariness of our international relations today, which reflects the fact that the ruling class has no clear project after 20 years, 30 years after the Cold War began to end. And I think in this respect, US hegemony is in decline, but not through the classical imperialist decline. It's more arbitrary than that, more dangerous than that. And that we need to understand just how it's a subjective crisis, not just one driven by the old conventional search for raw materials or new markets or new sources of exploitable labour power. There is all of that, that's the old laws of motion, but there's a whole lot of new stuff in there now, which we need to comprehend without imagining that we are very sophisticated about it. Well done for Platypus for understanding that the left has been dead for a long time. You're a bit late to the party, because some of us, I fear, attended the funeral a lot earlier. But nevertheless, if you want to join in that funeral and realise that we're at the end of a period and not yet at the beginning of one, but with addressing these points in the way that I've tried to begin to do, then we can have a great party, which is what I look forward to. Thank you.
I'm going to ask each to respond to the other presentations for 1 to 2 minutes, and then I'll bring in questions from the audience.
Thank you. Well, it's hard to know where to start. Since the last speaker was the last speaker, it's immediately in my mind. The question isn't really what's going to happen to Asia. It's quite clear where Asia is. China is not going to take over the world. Its level of productivity is below that of the United States on any criterion you want. I've looked through the statistics. It's very, very clear. It's not going there. And we can see, in fact, now it's in tremendous trouble. It's much more likely to disintegrate than do the reverse. The question doesn't therefore arise. We're left with the same position that we have for the last 150 years, or 150 years, 130 years. Well, capitalism, which is in decline, I didn't have time to discuss it, I've written enough about it. Capitalism, which is in decline, the question of inventing, not inventing, was of course discussed in the Second International, is discussed by Lenin in some detail in his work and so forth. It's not difficult to see that, it's not particularly now. It's very obviously true now, because you just look at the kind of stuff that's coming out like that produced by Apple, which one should really call it the biggest, the most important packaging company in the world. It hasn't invented anything very much. That's perfectly true, but so what? What's the issue? The fact is that the rate of growth has been lower, particularly in the last 30 years. Quite true. So what? The fact is that the vast majority of people in the world don't have enough. It isn't a question of absence of resources. Resources are there. But given the inequality which exists, given the inefficiency of capitalism itself, it is inefficient. It's not able to provide resources for the majority of people. And that applies to this country as well as it does to any other country, not just to Africa and Asia. It applies to this country, as we know. So you have to go down the road. Or for that matter, coming from Scotland, areas of Scotland, as you know, it's been brought out that there's no point in cutting the pension in particular areas because people die before 65 anyway. So that is really the issue, that capitalism itself can be overthrown. The forms of the future society are here. We can see it, a society which is run in the interest of the majority, a planned society which is run from below, with people from below take part in the planning, however that actually takes place. And where the antagonistic forms which exist today will be abolished. One can go into detail, we've all been there or should have been there. So I don't think there's a problem in that. But it is still true, in spite of what the speakers are saying, the majority of the population don't have that hope. The fundamental reason why they don't have that hope isn't just commodity federalism, which I think is still there, although it's much more limited than it was and has been shot through. It is what happened in the first and semi-second world, what do you call the Soviet Union? The fact is the Soviet Union proclaimed itself socialist, and it was the exact opposite. One couldn't call it anything else. It was an absolute disaster from a social point of view, never mind any other question. Who on earth would actually want that? Equally, social democracy failed. People have seen that. They've seen what the Labour Party is. So where do you go politically? That's the issue. They don't actually believe it's possible. They would hope it is possible. The rationale from there isn't just to talk about desire or overcoming it. The fact is the central issue is today production, and to get the level of production which is required. And for that you actually need a political party to take the bank.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I just have a few points, most of which are actually questions, really, or things we can also perhaps throw out to the audience later on. In regards to Hillel's paper, I mean, actually, I think more or less we probably all agree that we are living in a moment of crisis, a crisis which is probably insoluble, and it certainly poses the question of what comes next, what system of social relations we can move into. Is any alternative possible? Hillel, you mentioned one possible path is to move into socialism, but I'm sort of interested to know what that might look like, whether that would involve kind of a revolutionary transition period, how indeed that can actually be conceived or imagined today, avoiding the pitfalls of the historical examples of socialism that you've mentioned. The notion of class struggle, of course, was quite important to your talk, but I mean, how do you reconcile the idea of class struggle with the very evident way in which class identities have shifted, fragmented, become blurred? They're clearly not the same kind of class dynamic today that existed in sort of the heyday of the Marxist and socialist workers' movements. David Graeber, I very much liked your point actually about your sort of paradoxical formulation, which was to kind of show that neoliberalism is really about the predominance of politics over economics, which is quite an unusual way to think about it in some senses, because we tend to think about neoliberalism as being precisely opposite, don't we? But in a way, I suppose we can say the two things are precisely, the two sides of the same coin, aren't they? I mean, the obsession with the preoccupation rather with economics of politics produces precisely the opposite dynamic, which is to say that you have a kind of a political and ideological program which doesn't even obey its own kind of economic rationality and its own economic logic. And also, I very much liked your idea of the sort of imminent power, if you like, of movements like Occupy, the way in which, in a sense, the system is crumbling. These movements and indeed the opportunities that we have, I mean, I think are quite remarkable. I mean, I really don't think this is a time for sort of desolate gloom. I think on the contrary, this is a time for some kind of political confidence. James Woodhouse. Well, look, the notion of false consciousness, that was Engels' term on Marx, and you're right there, but you surely wouldn't deny that Engels is the central part of the Marxist tradition. The notion of ideology and ideological distortion has been quite central to Marxist politics. And what Marxist theory had to come up with an explanation as to why the working class, against all seeming objective conditions, would not revolt, why they somehow internalized bourgeois values. And this was their whole theory of ideologies. I mean, I thought it was making a really uncontroversial point about the way in which we can no longer sustain this theory or this notion of ideological distortion, or this idea that somehow we've been prevented from seeing reality. I think we can see reality, but I think we have a different kind of attachment to the existing system, which is libidinal rather than sort of epistemological knowledge. No environmental crisis. Well, I think such a statement is so sort of reasonable, actually.
Well, would you care to argue why there isn't one?
Well, all you know, virtually, I mean, not a day goes by when one doesn't hear about, you know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I see. No, there's all a big conspiracy. Is that right? It's a conspiracy of everyone.
It's a conspiracy of the Guardian.
Right. Well, this gets us on to the notion of the press. Actually, I wasn't quite sure about your point about the. You talked about the possibility of liberal regulation of the media. I wasn't quite sure whether you were sort of against it or for it. But anyway, I think the point is that even though I'm in a sense indifferent to what happens, really, because no one really believes in this anyway, that in a sense, I think we can say that the power in our society has now shifted to the media and to what might be called kind of, you know, mediated or communicative capitalism. So we shouldn't necessarily be too worried, I don't think, about a kind of regulation of the press. I mean, power now is with the media. Power is not in the hands of governments anymore.
We can come back to.
We'll come back. Okay, yeah.
Okay, well, where do I start? I'll just take up one thing. I find myself in strong agreement and equally strong divergence from everybody in different ways, so it'd be hard to go on about it. For example, the point about technological stagnation, I actually run that on myself. I totally agree with that. I think although I think that capitalism has got to a point where it really can no longer produce any sort of meaningful innovation in the way that it used to before. It used to be a sort of driver of technological innovation. That has become exactly the opposite, I think, is one of the key signs that it's reached this latter days. But I don't think East Asia is going to be that different in the long run. That's probably where we differ on that. But one thing I kind of feel obliged. The situation reminds me a little of a seminar I did in New York where I sort of described what I thought were the changing class alignments that made the Occupy movement possible. And I argue that actually the declining rate of profit, the financialization of capital, the sort of creation of a system whereby government and finance become essentially almost so deeply entwined with one another, one can hardly tell the difference between them, and the whole thing has become a means of endlessly elaborated rent extraction, so that all of a sudden the sort of plight of an indebted college graduate, which normally 20, 30 years ago would not have been something that would deeply move the heart of the average transit worker, for example, in New York, becomes something people actually do identify with. People who are working poor and people with student loans are the two people who can't do what everyone else was doing at the time, which is starting to liquidate their loans in one way or another, through default or otherwise. I could go into the whole thing, but the point was, I gave this whole talk, and some Marxist sectarian who I won't mention in the audience, sort of came out and said, I disagree with everything you say, it's not greed, it's not about greed. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? I didn't mention greed once in my entire thing. And then I had another person come at me and say, this whole idea that the individual is the only locus of politics is absurd. And I said, I see your class analysis. What are you talking about? I think people have this pocket idea of what certain people are supposed to say, and they just, no matter what you say or do, they'll just throw it at you. I mean, the idea that Occupy, I've been to 1,000 Occupy meetings. I don't remember hearing the word greed once. Where is this coming from? No, wrong. But I also don't think that we actually are just better singularities at this point. I think it's something more complex. I don't know if we necessarily have a language to it. There are class segments and deep, profound new forms of social alliance that are happening. And I think the most important theoretical job is to think how to think about this. Now that the party form is not going to be the form by which we represent ourselves, which causes a certain sort of way of imagining social alliances, we need very hard to think about what's happening now.
Well, I don't think you're quite right about one thing, Dana, which is that I'm not saying there's no more innovation. There is innovation. And if you look at the R&D intensives of pharmaceutical companies, they're spending, still now, although they're cutting it, 15% of sales revenues on new pharmaceutical formulations. There are many problems with what they do, but innovation hasn't ended, but there is an innovation crisis. Now, you've had the misfortune of going to 1,000 meetings of Occupy. I'm sure you may never have heard the word greed, but I put it to you respectfully that the critique of bankers, which Hillel began, is all about their executive pay, about their bonuses, is about their greediness, and this has nothing in common with Marx's political economy, even if you just wanted to be classical about it. Also, their hostility to consumption, hostility to fridges, the Occupy movement, that is a hostility to greed. None of you should have a fridge freezer, even when, global warming really sends the temperatures up the spout in Britain, because that would be greedy. So, anyway, fridges, let's hear it for fridges. That's my slogan for today. Sean had something in common with Hillel. Hillel said that people have seen through, if I had you right, but maybe my hearing's gone, but that people have, they know how bad the Labour Party is. I think that's partly a bit true, but I think that when Sean says we can see reality, but our attachment is libidinal, and we all mispronounce each other's names. Actually, you had mine wrong, so allow me to pay the compliment back. When you say attachment is libidinal, speak for yourself. But it seems to me that you're hinting at that green trope that the masses are guilty of false consciousness because they want a new fridge. They desire a new fridge. And I'm not sure that that's fair on the masses, and I put it to you that for you to say that power has shifted to the media from governments, there's some truth in that, but then to go on to say, or to precede that remark with the view that you are indifferent to Leveson. We face in this country, and the left should take this seriously, the most serious challenge to a crap, non-free press than we've ever had. We face government regulation under the guise of independent regulation. An independent regulator would regulate all of the publications that we see here today. So for you to express your indifference on Leveson is quite a call. Just to end, my old friend, or guru really, Hillel, seems to me, Hillel, that you say, well, there was always a crisis of invention. I think the acoustics are not good. I talk about innovation, there's a difference. And there's always been that crisis, and that Asia makes no difference. And I think that's a bit biblical too. Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's always the same crisis that we appear to be in. And it's a bit of time since I've been to Scotland, but from what I read of healthy life expectancies, thousands of millions of Scots are not dying earlier than 60. Actually, they're walking without a stick for longer and longer. They still smoke more than the English, but if you actually look at life expectancies, even in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and you look at life expectancies in Britain, they are not the same as yesterday. The health of the population is qualitatively improved. And that's not to say the cuts aren't damaging in many places, but I think the problem that we face cannot be compared with the return to the workhouse that Hillel rightly says they can't do, but you raise as a spectre in front of us. We must understand what has changed and what some things have changed for the better.
Okay. So I'd like to open it up to questions now, and I'm going to take one at a time.
Take some women, please.
All right, do you have a question? Do you want to think of one? I'll come back to you.
Too much willy waving going on.
I shouldn't say we did try to invite some women today, but they couldn't make this particular date, and we wanted to sort of have our panel with the ACI because we wanted to support their initiative. Okay.
I'm Simon Perani, I'm a white guy over 40, I have a fridge, and I think everybody in Asia should have a fridge. I just want to say two things. One, I think the important thing about Asia is not the relationship between China and Japan and this fight they're having. I think the important thing is social movements in Asia. I think the big strike movement in China, the movement of landless labourers in India, something I've been involved in campaigning on, the big strike movement in Kazakhstan, biggest in the post-Soviet period, which ended with a terrible massacre of oil workers. I think these things are important, and I think what's important about Occupy, which kind of lives quite a different life from the one that James thinks it does, the future of Occupy will be how it relates to those movements outside the richest countries such as the one we live in. The second thing I wanted to say was to try to bring together the point about resource crisis and innovational crisis. I think it's the same thing. I think it's I think the thing about the resources running out is a huge misunderstanding. I think what we see is capitalism, which just as it alienates the relationship between humans, also alienates or causes deep alienation in the relationship between humans and the planet they live on. James, you're absolutely right. The amount of fresh water has not changed in the last 30 years, but the way that industrial agriculture misuses that water in order to produce hamburgers for North American teenagers to eat, to ruin their health, while millions of people, many more people, are on the edge of starvation. I mean, to me, that's a problem, and it's a problem of capitalism, and I think that's what we're all here fighting with. And you talk about R&D in pharmaceutical companies, but the vast majority of R&D money in pharmaceutical companies is spent to produce drugs that are not needed for unhappy people who live alienated lives in the first world, instead of spending it on generic drugs which could easily save millions of people from early death in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think what we should do is discuss this so-called resource crisis and the so-called innovation crisis as one, which is part of the capitalist crisis.
I'm going to ask people to respond after each question. So.
Okay.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Okay. Are there any women who'd like to ask a question? Okay.
Sorry, I won't need a microphone.
Okay.
I want to come back to what I think.
Benefit from you using a microphone.
Sorry?
The folks at home
Okay, I'll use the microphone.
would benefit from you using a microphone.
Saul, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to come back to what you said about the differing and basically the change of class dynamics and how that might have an effect on whether revolution is possible or not. Sorry.
No, you were okay? Yeah, sorry, go on.
Alright, so, you're completely honestly right. Basically, Marx was dealing with a more industrial class. Now today we're dealing with like an office and service work class. So yeah, the aesthetics of class has definitely changed. The way the class looks has definitely changed. But I think one of the things that we have to remember when we're talking about the working class is that the core social relations between the working class and the exploiters has not changed. And it's that very social relation. It's that very social relation that actually empowers the working class to overthrow the system. So yeah, the class looks different, the aesthetics are different, but the social relations actually act exactly the same. So our power, therefore, is the same. And we can see our power if we look back to the November the 30th last year. We can see our power if we look back to the 20th of October this year. We can see our power if we look back to the student demonstrations 2 years ago and last week. So, fair enough, the aesthetics have changed, but that has absolutely no influence whatsoever on whether revolution is possible. Secondly, you questioned what a socialist society would look like, and you seem to imply that because we can't answer what a socialist society would look like, that therefore makes the concept of socialism and revolution inept. No, absolutely incorrect. Marx specifically said he's not going to provide a recipe for the food store of the revolution, because capitalism shapes your mind in such a specific way that we can't theorize about what a socialist society is going to look like. We have to, and this is what Marx said, learn through struggle. We have to try a socialist system, we have to try a revolution and basically learn on that basis what a socialist society would look like. But simply because we can't, through some sort of postmodern ideology, theorize about what a socialist society would look like, that does not at all make the concept of revolution and socialism at all inept.
I had a point for each member of the panel, so if I could just make them very quickly. What David Graeber said when he opened up his comments reminded me of something from the previous panel. where Mark Fisher mentioned the idea that in being opposed, being anti-authoritarian, the left should not concede authority to the right. And I thought that was maybe the most interesting and intelligent thing he said in his talk. And listening to you say, as to you all being men over 40, the reason you're on the panel is because you're supposed to have authority. We're here because we're interested to hear what you have to say, because we respect your authority, because you've written a book which has been widely lauded, and we're interested in your authority. So shrinking from it and hiding behind it, talking in these mangled terms of identity politics, isn't going to get the left anywhere. So you've got authority, use it, and use it well. Linking to what Saul said about insurrection as a model as opposed to revolution, isn't that what we've got in Greece right now, where it's actually not going anywhere? You can have insurrection and people can occupy the streets and they can occupy the square for a bit, and then the next day the police will be back and the Troika will be in charge again. And slowly but surely that oppositional energy becomes dispersed, people collapse in on their private lives, they try to adjust and accommodate to the situation, and that ends up being totally exhausted and eventually spends itself out. Because the point is, the authorities that be don't have to move anywhere. All they need to do is stay there where they are. An insurrection that never actually manages to establish a revolution or to take power will get nowhere. And if there's no forward momentum or any kind of actual establishment of their own goals and aims, eventually they collapse in on themselves. And I think that's already what's happening in Greece, as gradually all the opposition seems like it's disintegrating away, and all you have is the stasis and continuation of the situation. So insurrection as a better model than revolution, I don't think you've sold it at all. And then just a point for Hillel about the depression and whether we're in a depression or not. Isn't part of making that calculation not one purely on the economic figures and statistics, but also on the place of a workers' movement within that, the privileged revolutionary agent that Saul was so snobby about at the beginning, where you have, there is no organized labor movement to speak of in Western countries. And so I'm interested to hear how you think that changes your assessment of the overall situation, those various scenarios that you outlined, because that seems to me a crucial aspect of assessing whether or not we're in a depression or not. And then finally for James Woodhuysen, you said it's the same classical laws of motion with a bit of stuff on top. Please do tell us more.
Okay, I think I'll bring some answers back in, or responses back from the panelists now, and then take another round of questions.
Well, I'll just take the last question which I just asked. I was asked whether, in fact, I should define depression in terms of the action of the working class or the ability of the working class to organise itself in order to take power. Well, it's never been done that way, and I don't think that is why a depression in itself takes place, although it is part of it. Marx defined it in the way I gave originally in terms of all the contradictions of the system. In other words, one has to look at the system itself not just in terms of the subjective aspect, but the objective aspect itself, the structure. What's happening is the structure is cracking. What we need, the next step, it's true, for the working class to take power. The working class to act as a class. And as Marx puts it, once it becomes a class, the society dissolves. Which links actually to a point which I don't mean just said over here. Marx did use the word false consciousness. Commodity fascism is that false consciousness. It's very clear the way I have to use it. But once the society, once the class comes into existence as a class, the society dissolves. That has to be our aim, for the class to come into existence and the society dissolves. You don't have an intermediate period of depression, as it were. Depression is a collapse of the structure because the contradictions cannot be dealt with. What is happening is the mediating forms cannot mediate. The structure begins to fall apart. That is what's happening. Now, the fact that the working class can't act is unfortunate, but it seems to me we can explain it, and there wasn't time for me to go into it, but basically we explained it in terms of the terrible disaster that was the Soviet Union. We explain it through imperialism, the long subjection of the third world, which we talked about here, and which is still not ended, in fact, which is a major problem. I think we have to understand in these terms. Nonetheless, the breakdown of the structure, and it is a structure, it doesn't make any difference what the objective feeling is. It is there, is important. But it's also the case that you cannot simply, and I have to say this, have an insurrection. There is a state, there is a structure. It will defeat the insurrection before it even begins. In my view, it is one of the worst things you could even dream up. Look how many people have been killed in so-called insurrections. The last thing we want is another tens of millions being killed, wherever it was, 50 million in China, even in the national liberation struggles, which abstractly we support, but when millions get killed, you cannot support it. That isn't what you want. I'm not saying one shouldn't take power, one shouldn't fight to take power, but an insurrection is crazy. That's the last thing we should be talking about. The ruling class will simply use it against us. That isn't what we want. Thank you.
Peacefully if you can, forcefully if you must.
Okay, just a couple of points. Question of class identities, the shifting nature of class dynamics. My point is not necessarily that there aren't classes anymore. I think we both agree that these classes, probably contain different kinds of subjectivities now from Marx's time. I think you acknowledge that. My point's more to do with the political expression of class. In other words, when we come to movements like Occupy, it seems to me the class itself is really not the key factor here. It's really not the key identity, because the very fact that you have people from different kinds of classes and different groups coming together indicates there's already kind of a sort of a move away, or a sort of a displacement from a kind of strict class identity. Right, so the question is more to do with the relationship between class and politics, and I don't think there is kind of a direct sort of relationship there anymore, which was always sort of presupposed in Marxist theory. My point about socialism was not necessarily to say that socialism is impossible, but I do genuinely want to know what socialism, as is imagined in Marxist theory, might look like. The point you made about Marx not laying down any blueprints is precisely true. I would actually put the whole focus on experimentation, which I actually talked about in my paper. I don't think we necessarily, I'm certainly not saying we have to have a vision of what socialism would look like for us to actually entertain the possibility of it, but I think the point is that it's kind of an open-ended project, right? Whether we call it socialism, whether we call it anarchism or autonomy, to me, socialism has to involve some form of sort of, mutual aid and cooperation, and I think it's very interesting to actually think about what form that might take today. To me, it certainly cannot take the form of the kind of the revolutionary seizure of state power and the use of kind of authoritarian state power to kind of build socialism, because I think this is where we get onto all of the pitfalls that we've discussed. And this also gets me onto the whole notion of revolution, right? And what I mean by insurrection is something different from that. It seems to me that the whole logic of the revolution is this kind of grand event, whereby a working class, but it's not really a working class, is it? Of course, it's a revolutionary vanguard which leads the working class, which seizes state power, right, and then uses state power to kind of build socialism. To me, that whole project is completely discredited from historical experience. This does precisely lead to the kind of bloodshed that you were talking about. So what is the insurrection? The insurrection is not an event of that kind. The insurrection has to be seen also as more than simply, violent clashes with the police. I think this is where insurrectionary politics or insurrectionary politics, anti-politics is at its least interesting, at least imaginative. No, the insurrection is an ongoing project of autonomy, an ongoing project of people choosing to live in new kinds of ways. And I think really what's much more interesting in Greece at the moment is not so much the clashes with the police, but all of the various sort of distributed and exchange networks and kind of food distribution networks are actually emerging in the wake of the collapse of the state. To me, that's what the insurrection is about. It's sort of ongoing process of kind of elaborating and experimenting with new forms of exchange and new forms of kind of cooperation and being together. Right, that's how I understand the insurrection. I'll pass it over to David.
Oh, okay. What shall I say? Well, I want one last response to the whole Greek thing. It's you know, when people in the workers' movement in the 1860s, or, you know, in Marxist Communist Party, you know, had chants and slogans, they didn't actually say, you know, the organic composition of capitalism will inevitably lead to the decline rate of profit. You know, chants are one thing. You can intervene in specific issues in specific ways. The other, you know, you do that to start a conversation where you bring in your entire analysis. So it would be helpful to just go to the analysis and not look at the chants, because, you know, anybody can make fun of each other's chants. You know, power to the people. Like, so what are you saying by power? What's the analysis? Or what's you saying by people? That's, you know, totally false analysis. You know, it's silly. In terms of that, I also wanted to actually answer the person who was saying that innovation and environmental crisis and so forth resources are the same crisis. I agree with that. I actually, and the point about certain technologies are being advanced, and there are technologies which make it easier to pacify people or make it work too much. I totally think that is correct. I think there's two levels of what's going on in terms of the massive, you know, failure of capitalism to. One of its great claims was, all right, well, we suck in a lot of ways, but at least, like, we're causing technological advance that will eventually make things better and make people's lives easier. I don't think, you know, capitalism can really make that claim anymore, and increasingly people aren't even trying. And I think there's two things that happened. I think in the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of people actually decided that maybe Marx was right about the organic composition of capital, and that, you know, everybody's talking all the time about robot factories, the end of work, you know, situations, and yippies, all those guys getting really excited, no more manual labor, and the ruling class freaked out. There was a very self-conscious movement. You could even see them talking about it, and it emerged in public discourse like a little later with people like Alvin Toffler and George Gilder. You know, I think all our social problems and unrest are caused by too rapid and uncontrolled technological change. We got to do something about this. And there was a conscious shift away from the sort of space-age technologies that were doing to compete with the Soviet Union, which was no longer seen as a threat, and putting it into medical technology, information technology, all the research money shifted, and finally military technology. And yeah, it's true, even for the medical stuff, we don't have a cure for cancer, but we have Ritalin and we have Prozac, and we have all these things which are essentially there to, like, make people be able to survive somehow vaguely sane during all the crazed intensification of work that came from the information technology, if possible. So it's all about, you know, technologies that would reassert social control. On the other hand, it's also true that, like, you know, like, you think of all this money they're pouring into the military stuff, you'd at least have, like, giant killer robots shooting death rays from their eyes and stuff like that. You know, God knows they were working on that, and they haven't even been able to do that, right? So I think there is, like, a basic breakdown, which I think comes from corporate managerialism, which is a generalized war on the imagination, which is happening on all levels for social reasons, has also, like, ultimately hobbled even technologies that would benefit them. It's kind of a long story.
Well, it's the first time I've heard false consciousness made equivalent to commodity fetishism and then made equivalent to Ritalin and Prozac. So thanks for that. But I think the woman at the back, I think you're entirely right. The social exploitation is the same, even if the aesthetics have changed. But I think one thing hasn't changed, if I may say, which is the left's overestimation of itself. You know, David said that the ruling class is scared of 300 anarchists, and Saul is out to, you know, convince us that the autonomous spaces opened up by Occupy, you know, amount to an insurrection. I thought if you looked at the code of conduct that the Occupy movement in London insisted on, where you have to raise your hand before you speak and not make genderist, sexist, and any kind of remarks that would not go down well in polite society. I think that all of that overestimates the left's influence and overestimates its independence from bourgeois ideology. If we're going to talk about bourgeois ideology, then the adoption of a politically correct agenda by Occupy about how you conduct meetings, and the belief that was made there at the top that, you know, just because the four of us share common genitalia, we've all been engaged in willy waving. Well, you can have that point of view if you like, but it confirms for me that the left is very much self-absorbed and has no influence, absolutely no influence, and that is congruent with the death of the left for many years. Now, the comrade over there said, reported my view that the laws of motion are the same, but there's a lot of new stuff on top. I think I'll try to hint at the new stuff. I think that, I mean, politically, to hear that the problem with the pharmaceutical industry is that it makes drugs for unhappy first worlders, and that's a big problem. We're back to Ritalin and Prozac again. You know, my critique of today's conditions is that the pharmaceutical industry is not innovative enough. 10 years after the Human Genome Project, we still can't buy any personalized medicine off the shelves of Boots or anything like that. And, you know, that speaks of a crisis of innovation, not at the front end of the process, because Lenin himself observed that R&D was being socialized before the First World War. That was at the front of it when you founded the first commercial laboratory at General Electric to investigate pure scientific principles. That's what happened in that period of imperialism. Today you face a situation where Big Pharma doesn't want to do innovation, it wants to do marketing, distribution, production, a little bit manufacture, and above all dealing with state regulation. It does not want to develop the kind of drugs that we need in the first and the third world. So, you know, that is.
Can I interrupt you, since that's what you like and you're proving of that? I actually started by saying we don't have a cure for cancer, we do have other drugs.
I wasn't talking about you, David. I was talking about the crisis of innovation and how it's different from before. That is something that's new on top, in the way that they don't want to invest in genetically modified trees like the Brazilians do, which I think is part of the East in my conception. Nobody wants genetically modified anything in Europe. Genetically modified trees would be a great carbon sink. They grow in 7 years, not 70. That's all terrific. But they don't want to do that in the West because they're too risk averse. And that's a new phenomenon on top. They were not that risk averse in the 30s. FDR, for all his many and manifest faults, said all that we have to fear is fear itself. We don't hear that from Ed Miliband or David Cameron.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take two more questions. I've seen one up here, and then I'll take one more.
Hi, my name is Roxanne. I suppose it is a question. We kind of had it answered in the second round when Saul came back. The other female speaker basically made the points that were in my head, and I'm glad that she did. I didn't think I'd be making, or we'd have to make, what I regard as fairly basic Marxist points, that there are still two classes in society. One of them is a ruling class, and one of them is our class. And we sell our labour power, even though the nature of the way we do that has changed to a certain extent. I would challenge some of the assumptions you've made, such as that the seizure of state power is not the way to go. I would say exactly the opposite. I would challenge your assumption that the Revolutionary Party is no longer one of the essential tools for that change. I would say exactly the opposite. But that's a whole other conversation. To use your words, you said there's an ongoing project of autonomy. Choosing to live in different ways. Can you clarify? It sounds very wishy-washy to me. Talked about different networks in Greece, about delivering food and so on, and other things. It made me think of Golden Dawn giving out food, which I assume is not what you're referring to, but that's what the Greek working class has been reduced to until it seizes power, and that's the only way it's going to change its situation. and it will continue to have to do that. There's a lack of revolutionary leadership in Greece, just like there is around the world. And actually, your ideas, comrades, are not actually that new.
I'm really sorry, everyone, but we are running out of time, so I'm going to ask everyone to ask the panelists to respond to that last question as part of their closing remarks. Okay, so I'll go in reverse order.
What are we talking about?
Closing remarks. Okay, we'll take it down.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, obviously I agree with the comrade who just put those points. It's absolutely true that the majority of society, our society in Britain, sell their labour power. They are the working class. Doesn't matter whether they're white collar or blue collar. That is absolutely true. It's also true, of course, that to concede with the gentleman on my far right here, the nature of the class, the nature of the class has internally changed somewhat, and that there are more white collar workers than blue collar workers. But so what? They sell the labour power, of course. The relationship remains the same. That's absolutely true. What has changed in the world, and I'm rather surprised it wasn't taken up by is of course that we don't live in a competitive society. In spite of the fact that the propaganda is competition, everybody has to compete with everybody else, everybody is a unique, independent atom who has to fight everybody else in order to exist, which is the way the government puts it, and the Labour Party doesn't seem to oppose. In spite of that, the fact is that the world is more integrated, the society is more integrated, and in terms of the economy, what we've got is an increasing degree of monopoly, or an increasing degree of non-competition, which explains the so-called risk-averse thing that's been referred to. I'm surprised that it wasn't referred to. But the fact is that is the way it is. When the government talks of competition, it's not talking about competition the way Adam Smith did, or in the 19th century. All it means is 3 or 4 firms which do not constitute competition, as we all know. The 3 or 4 firms in a particular industry, they'll then collude, of course. They do collude, and every so often they find. So what? They just go on with it. So of course there isn't that kind of incentive to produce new inventions. But my point against that, and that's very obvious, is that capitalism is not supplying what is supposed to be supplied. But of course it wouldn't do that. What is capitalism about? Making everybody feel happy? Since when is that the case? Since when is it the duty of capitalists to feed anybody? Or for that matter, since the question of drugs was brought up, since when is it the duty of capitalists to keep people healthy? Now, I'm surprised in terms of the question of drugs, the example wasn't given of antibiotics. Why are they not producing antibiotics? We all know that they're running out. And the answer comes from the companies. Well, if we went on spending money on antibiotics, what would happen is we'd cure everybody. We couldn't sell them then. The same argument is given for malaria. If we cured people of malaria, we no longer have to sell the drug that cures people of malaria, etc. Now that is the nature of modern capitalism. Of course, capitalism for the capitalist is a means of making money. Accumulation takes him over. It isn't that he's greedy, that is the nature of the system. Accumulate, as Marx says. That is the law of Moses and his prophets. That is the law of capitalism. There is no other law which actually dominates it in that way. That has remained all throughout. By the way, since the question of laws has been raised, and laws of motion, the term, although people usually think of in terms of Marx, quite rightly, actually goes back to the time of Adam Smith. Not that he used it, but one of his correspondents actually used it. So it is a general term, as it were, not just from Marx. And if you talk of the laws of capitalism, well, what is it that now exists? When you have a society in which the government plays a crucial role, however much they rant and rave, whether it's Reagan or Thatcher, the government continues to play a crucial role in the society as it is today. We know that. It's not just a question of GDP, though that's enough. What is it in France? It's over 50%, Sweden and so forth. This country 40%. So obviously, what one's talking about is, in that respect, society in change towards a more social society where the majority can control. That has to be the ultimate aim of every human being, everybody who is human, so that we can have a genuine human society controlled from below and not from on top. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, I'll just sort of use my last couple of minutes just to address the last question that was asked of me, as well as make a couple of general comments. Just firstly, in regards to Hillel, I mean, to me, it seems to me the problem that we have faced is precisely capitalism for a certain period of time has kept us happy. Capitalism has a certain vested interest in keeping us happy. That's why it produces Prozac, for instance. I mean, this is the point that someone like Franco Berardi makes. He talks about the Prozac economy. Right, he talks about a whole kind of way of life which is based upon a sort of an overstimulation of the senses. The trouble is obviously that this sort of artificially induced happiness isn't working anymore. I mean, we are experiencing a certain kind of, I think, generalized psychological breakdown. It seems to me that, depression and anxiety, for instance, I'm talking about psychological depression as well as economic depression here, of course, are symptoms of this crisis. And this is why precisely it's not a question of knowledge or a question of ideology, it's a question of our libidinal attachment to a certain system that has at the same time enslaved us. Right, 1 minute, okay. Look, the last point was to do with this whole notion of seizure of state power. Look, you talk about wishy-washiness. To me, nothing is more wishy-washy than the idea that somehow there is this thing called, this sort of apparatus called the state, that you can seize in a revolutionary project. It just simply does not figure anymore. I mean, we can talk about power operating in a network fashion. Does it can really be centralized within the sort of centralized kind of sovereign structure that you imagine we call the state? What would that look like? What does the revolutionary seizure of power look like? It's simply unimaginable today for reasons that power has become dispersed, networked, and globalized. It simply cannot work. And you lament the failure of, or the rather lack of revolutionary leadership in Greece. I point to the absurd role that the Greek communist Stalinist party plays in parliament, where they actually defend parliament against the anarchists, because they're the only ones who can actually pronounce when is the right time for revolution. This is what the Communist Party has always done. They claim a hegemony on revolutionary knowledge. We're the ones who tell you when is the time to revolt. That's what they say. That's what they're doing. And that's precisely why there is no... I mean, it's precisely this...
Syriza is a majority there against the KKK.
So Syriza was, yes.
They're a minority now. So
ignorance was currency. Mellenbank would charge you to speak.
Actually, my impression is that the problem in Greece is there's way too much revolutionary leadership. I mean, like 37 different parties, all of which hate each other. But let's not go into that. I want to make this two remarks. One is I'm really kind of shocked and disturbed by the overt hostility to my remarks about the composition of this panel. Not the remarks and the fact that people are making them, but like the fact that people are sort of implying that anyone who thinks that the fact that like this is all white males is not a coincidence, which is completely irrelevant, is themselves sort of PC, what was the term being used? I mean, Jesus, it makes me really wonder, if we want to understand why the left isn't getting anywhere in taking advantage of this crisis, I think there you got the answer right there. What's that? Well, I'm not going to next time if it goes on like this. To be perfectly honest, I don't know what it is. I mean, this keeps happening over and over again. I'm disturbed by it because I'll tell you why. I mean, look, if these things were not relevant, if it's all just a coincidence, I'm the one who's making it up. Why is it we never actually see a single panel on the current crisis where everybody's a middle-aged woman? I mean, ever, once. I mean, insofar as you're not challenging the structures of basic structural violence that makes that never happen, you're participating in it. So, I mean, I'm just going to say that. So, as to the larger point, I mean, I think I wanted to address one last thing, which there's a point that, the basic structures of exploitation and extraction haven't changed. And there's just this thing on top. But the thing on top is getting bigger and bigger. And I think this is what we should really be talking about when we look at what's different about this crisis. I just wanted to open it up. Because if you look at where corporate profits are coming from, in the U.S. at this point, I think 11% of profits are coming from anything related to industry at all. And most of that's bullshit too, because GM, at least till 2008, all of its profits came from its financial sector and not from actually making cars, but from financing the selling of cars. So, putting that in the industry rather than finance seems a little deceptive. Yeah, so we actually are talking about a change in the structure of where corporate profits are coming from, and it's echoed in another change in how people actually relate to capital, so that less and less is being extracted from the wage. Oh yeah, and more directly taken. Like, back when I was in college, they used to say that this, feudalism was direct political extraction of, and capitalism was indirectly through the wage. Well, we should really be looking at this 25% or 20%, no one's sure of the numbers. The average American household's income is having taken away directly by the fire system. So that actually is a change in the structure of capitalism that's going on right before us. And I think it explains a lot about changing forms of opposition to it. I just wanted to throw that out.
Well, it's interesting that quite a lot of the discussion has been about pharmaceutical innovation, and I think that's refreshing, really. When Hillel says that they won't sell antibiotics to people because that would kind of, make them, if I heard you right, Hillel, they're too healthy and all of this. When has the capitalist system ever been interested in the health of the working class? Well, in the 60th, 70th anniversary of the Beveridge Report, just about this week, I would reassure Hillel, and I'm sure he knows, that the Beveridge Report, and indeed British social legislation by Lloyd George after the Boer War, has been quite concerned with the health of the population. It might not sound good to say it, but it has been, because they needed proper support, proper supply of labour power. I think what's new about the situation is that if you take antibiotics, the thing that's raised now is that we're all going to become resistant to antibiotics, and that's why we should get into homeopathy and all the other things that the Occupy movement probably endorses. So it's a bit of a problem to say that it's the same old capitalism won't deliver antibiotic innovation. What it's really saying is we've had too much innovation. Now we need to go to alternative and complementary medicines. And I was struck by how the other speakers took up this sort of pharmaceuticals for unhappy people. It's Richard Layard of LSE, founded by the Webbs, who's advanced the happiness agenda. It's David Cameron who's wanted gross national well-being to be more important than gross domestic product. It's Sean, or is it Saul, or is it Steve, who wants to say that we've got a lot of mentally ill people here because of all the drugs. Well, it's Ed Miliband who's raised mental health, not of his own self, which would be worth discussing, but mental health is a real issue for Britain. So I'm really interested that to attack any of those views is... I'm just winding up. To attack any of those views is, as Hillel says, to be on his far right. I think it shows a certain independence from liberalism, which I think is the main task facing the left today.
I traveled from Middle East to England to America. The most polluted country actually is China. Now, if you go to America, is the most cleanest water.
Thank you very much.
Country is China.
Conversation
Over 100 million prostituted, 50 million from harvesting organ of people for their belief, and you are the truth, truthfulness, compassion.
Thank
You are
you.
not telling the truth.
Okay, thanks everyone.